who's leaning back and now plays e4. Now the world champion's still not in his seat. And the time control for the FIDE World Blitz, it's 3 minutes per side with a 2-second increment. It's pretty unprecedented. For one of the opponents not to be at their chair when the game begins, Magnus Carlsen does like to be fashionably late. 15 seconds have already elapsed. You can see Kovalev there waiting in anticipation for the opportunity to play the world champion. He is nowhere to be found. 30 seconds now, creeping down on his clock. Kovalev still sitting in the same spot. He's played 1e4. Now maybe Carlsen is simply deciding what opening he wants to play, but, you know, there's a time for preparation and there's a time for playing. 35 seconds. And you can see those playing diagonally in front of Kovalev, one of them looking back. I think that might be Fabiano Caruana. Where is the world champion? Someone's running to his chair. That appears to be Yu Yangi's opponent, who was 50 seconds late. What happened? Was there traffic in the tournament hall? So there was one guy who was late. Magnus Carlsen still hasn't shown up. 1 minute has passed. This is getting crazy. And the craziest thing, of course, is that Magnus Carlsen could still very much play a good game with only, 20 or 30 seconds left on the clock, but that would be absolutely crazy. Kovalev has not changed his sitting position at all this entire time. Now it's a minute and 20 seconds. Now Magnus might have confused the starting time of the round. That's happened before, but the starting time is usually announced before the previous round is started, so everybody else seemed to know when the round was starting. 90 seconds now off Magnus Carlsen's clock. That's over half his time. And Kovalev, what I love is that he has not changed his sitting position at all. He's scanning the tournament hall for the world champion. And of course, he does not want to win a game by forfeit. That would be a lame way to beat the world champion. He wants an opportunity to play a blitz game with him. You can kind of sense the disappointment on his face. There's only a minute left on the world champion's clock. His chair is left unoccupied. This is crazy. I've never seen anything like this. Now under a minute, he's got under a minute. Do you run to his chair and start playing? He's running to his chair. It's at least he has pants on. Oh my goodness, he's running up to the podium. He has to find his board. He's got about 40 seconds before he loses the game. He is running in a mad dash, and he makes it. He's got 30 seconds on his clock and still time for a handshake. And he sits down and he plays 1e6. So maybe he was choosing an opening this whole time. That would be pretty interesting. And he 31 seconds on Magnus Carlsen's clock as he plays the French defense, and Kovalev takes on d5, which is a decision I already don't like. He plays the exchange French, which is a pretty easy opening for black to blitz out the moves in. Something like knight c3 or maybe the advance would have forced Magnus Carlsen to slow down. Instead, Kovalev with an early c4, that often leads to an isolated queen-pawn structure. If, of course, black takes on c4 by Magnus Carlsen, delaying that move, he's already built up 35 seconds to his clock. And Kovalev's time advantage has shrunk down to a measly 2 minutes. As he contemplates his next move, he can push the c-pawn down to c5 and chase black's bishop away. Carlsen seems a little bit flustered, but he's playing the opening pretty decently thus far. Knight c3, bishop e2, a lot of moves possible, and it's actually not easy to handle a time advantage as big as the one that Kovalev has, because you're feeling the pressure to win the game quickly. But Carlsen can play well with 5 seconds on his clock, and Kovalev has already spent a minute. This is when move 4, move 5, he finally decides to bring his knight out to c3. Carlsen just ignores the threat on the d5 pawn, and he castles. If white takes on d5, that pawn is going to be a sitting duck, and it can be pretty easily recaptured by black's other knight, which will go to d7 and then to b6. And once black recaptures the pawn on d5, he's going to have a very nice blockading knight to immobilize white's isolated queen pawn on d4. Another 20 seconds spent by Kovalev. This is maybe even crazier than Carlsen's late arrival time. Kovalev cannot decide how to position his pieces. Maybe c5? I think the move bishop f1 to e2, just a modest developing move, could be the way to go. His time advantage is now under a minute. Maybe he's being nice to the world champion to equalize the playing field. And he does take on d5, covers the check with a rook, and there goes Magnus Carlsen's knight. He brings it to d7. He adjusts some pieces before pressing the clock. He is absolutely unconcerned. He does have more time than he started with, but of course he did start with 30 seconds. Kovalev castles kingside, and Carlsen more piece adjusting as he plays h6, preventing white's dark squared bishop from reaching g5. And maybe Kovalev should have played bishop g5 on the previous move when he still had a chance. Now the dark squared bishop doesn't have all that many good developing spots. He can bring it out to e3. but then Carlsen will recapture on d5 and the bishop on e3 will be under attack. I actually think the world champion's position is excellent here. He's going to win the pawn on d5. He's going to get a nice blockading knight on d5, and Kovalev is trying to gain activity for his other pieces. With knight to e5, Carlsen ignores the knight. He takes the pawn on d5, and maybe after a trade, Kovalev should try to position his light skirt bishop on f3 to chase the knight away from d5, but Carlsen could support it with the bishop from c8, which could go into e6, or from the pawn, which can move from c7 to c6. No question, Black's position is probably already slightly better, and look at the time situation is almost equalized. This is unbelievable. Kovalev has spent a total of 2 minutes on the first 5 or 6 moves, and he now has 30 seconds himself. They're basically playing a hyperbullet game with increment, and Carlsen does indeed push the pawn up to c6 and protects his knight on d5, and if I'm Kovalev, I'm trading pieces on d5. He doesn't. He brings his queen out to b3, putting more pressure on the world champion's knight, and now he does threaten to capture on d5 3 times. Carlsen leans back in his chair, and now he's finally begun taking the very little time that he has left, 15 seconds now on the clock, and he brings his own queen up to b6, offering an exchange of queens, and Kovalev instead takes the knight. We're going to see a lot of exchanges. The queens are going to be taken off the board very likely by white, or potentially even by black, or white could take on d5 twice. 10 seconds now, 10 seconds for Kovalev as he takes on d5, and he does not grab the pawn. Instead, he exchanges the queens. But getting an endgame against Magnus Carlsen, where the world champion has the bishop pair, is not a very advisable idea. 3 seconds for Kovalev as he brings his bishop out. Crazy that he is the one who has to make the moves for fear of losing on time. Carlsen was still with 15 seconds on the clock as he chases Kovalev's only active piece out of the center. Then he's going to bring his light skirt bishop presumably to f5. Then he could also bring it to e6 in order to secure the isolated queen pawn. First, he brings his rook up to a4 and he attacks the d4 pawn, and now he attacks the knight, and the knight is no good spots to go 1 second, as Kovalev has to bring it all the way back to e1, and a3 was a big mistake. Carlsen pushes his b pawn up to b5 and now brings the rook to c4. He's threatening the move b4. Kovalev is getting tortured here. He is getting massacred on the queen side, and the bishops are off the board. Kovalev is able to defend the b2 pawn, and now Carlsen starts expanding on the king side. This is what the world champion does. He does not let you breathe in these sorts of endgames, and he has positioned his pawns in an ideal setup, restricting white's king and knight as much as possible. The knight can't move to d3 because you lose the d4 pawn. It can't move to c2 because you lose the b2 pawn, so Kovalev has to basically sit around and wait. He is trying to improve the position of his knight. A great job getting the knight into the center and chasing Black's light skirt bishop away, but Carlsen is walking his king ever so gradually over to the queen side. King c6 and king b5, and eventually something is going to give. Kovalev still with 6 seconds on the clock. Carlsen going hither and thither, trying to chisel his way into white's position. The rook is currently parked on a4. He has to keep it in contact with one of white's pawns. No, he brings it up to a1, and white's rook does not have any active prospects, but rook d1 by Kovalev, keeping the gates to white's queenside shut. And there goes Carlsen's b pawn. He continues grabbing space and strangling white's pieces. Kovalev is just sort of staying put and bringing his king up to d3, where it almost gets checkmated by the bishop. A check on b5, driving the king back to c2. Now king b3 is a big threat that would win the b4 pawn, and Carlsen brings his bishop just in time to c4. The king moves up to b1, chasing the rook away, but the rook can go to the other side. It can go to h8. It can go to e8. It attacks the knight, and the knight moves. No, it takes the bishop. Oh, but this move's bad for Kovalev. The look at Carlsen's pawns on c4 and b4. Kovalev is shaking his head. The world champion might win this game. Rook d4 attacking Black's pawns, and king c5. There might be d6. So Carlsen pushes b3 and takes the pawn on f3, takes the pawn on c5. He is now up a pawn. The king is chasing the rook off of the b file, and rook f4 offers an exchange of rooks. The pawn endgame would obviously be lost for white because he's down a pawn, and the king is brought back down to d4. This is exquisite endgame technique by the world champion. He threatens to take the other pawn on g4. 2 seconds for Kovalev. He is desperately trying to defend, and he loses the second pawn on g4. He does pick up the pawn on b3, but Carlsen now has connected pass pawns which are rumbling down the board. Kovalev has to set his own pawn in motion, but it's not fast enough, and it's blocked by Black's rook, and he resigns the game. What a display by the world champion who started the game with only 30 seconds on his clock, and what a frustrating